These are really special blocks for me. I've had them ever since I was a child. In Scotland, interestingly enough, they were made in a workshop at an experimental, highly progressive school in Aberdeen, Scotland, developed through the teachings of Rudolf Steiner. And I remember as a child playing with them and just marveling at the craftsmanship of them. And I still do. What's interesting is I still play with them every so often because my son Ro plays with them now. And so I often build things with him. And I'm going to be using these blocks today to explain some concepts that a lot of you have been really interested in. And there's been a lot of questions and comments about this. And I thought the best way to explain this was the way that I explain it to my son, of using these blocks to explain how our brain processes information in very different ways. And I think I can do it using these childhood blocks that make it a really special connection for me and hopefully for you as well. So let's dive into this. Here's the idea. The idea is that our brain constantly defaults to what I refer to as cognitive or neurological preferences. So let's look at it from the perspective of these blocks. So let's say your brain has a neurological preference for taking data, evidence, and proof and bringing it down into a solid, rational conclusion. Now, your brain will do this over and over again very easily. A preference is something that's hardwired. Past the age of roughly 25, these preferences don't change. And your brain will constantly do this over and over again. Now, what's interesting is you are able to think in other ways. So if someone were to ask you, can you add some innovative thinking to this? Be more creative. What does that look like? You can do that. You can take this modality of thinking, this preference, and you can force yourself to do something else. It's referred to as a cognitive ability. So you can suddenly split it apart. Innovation is often splitting apart rational thinking. But that takes conscious effort. The difference between a preference, which your brain does naturally and easily and hardly feels like work, and forcing yourself to do something very different, an ability, is the cognitive load that it requires. It's cognitively uncomfortable. So the fundamental difference between an ability and a preference is an ability is learned. You train yourself to do it. You develop it over time. A preference, though, is hardwired. It's your natural modality of thinking. And what this means is that your brain will constantly do it over and over again. And as you can imagine, this plays out in the way that we communicate, we collaborate, we interact with people. It explains relationships. It explains our work, our professional life, our personal life, friendships. It explains so many aspects of our life because our brain is constantly defaulting back to the way that it likes to think. So how does your brain like to think? Well, there are many different ways that it does this. What I want to take you through is the idea of 4 neurological preferences. So there are 4 of them. And keep in mind that most of you will have multiple preferences. So what's interesting about this is it's overly simplistic to suggest that we have one single dominant preference. Less than 10% of the population do. So it's quite rare to actually have just a single preference. Most people will have 2 or 3 out of the 4. So statistically, it's fairly likely that you do. Now, only 1% of the general population have all 4 preferences, quad modal thinking. This is fairly rare, and some of you have actually sent me messages about this in the community, and it feels very overwhelming. Having all 4 preferences, as you can imagine, is cognitively very complex and layered. And so there's constantly a state of what I refer to as modality switching, switching between the preferences over and over again. And that gets very complicated, and it gets actually very overwhelming from the perspective of cognition. So let's go through the 4 preferences. What I want you to do is to try and self-identify, try and figure out what these preferences feel like to you as I'm describing them. Try and picture it for yourself. Is that what my brain likes to do? Self-identification is actually a fairly accurate way of doing this. So if it does resonate with you, it's fairly likely this is a preference for you. So here's the first one. Analytical thinking. I'm going to use my blocks to describe this because analytical thinking is a rational thinking preference in which someone with a dominant analytical thinking preference uses data, evidence, and proof to consolidate their thinking into a rational conclusion. Now, what's interesting about this is the way that they do this is by looking at the individual pieces of data and comparing them, analyzing them, looking for inconsistencies, errors. And it's only when they've looked at all the data, evidence, and proof, and they're satisfied with the accuracy and the consistency of it, that they're confident enough to come to a rational conclusion. Now, what's interesting about this is, for an analytical thinker, once they come to this conclusion, it's solid. It's very difficult to change the mind of an analytical thinker after they've looked at everything, looked at the data, evidence, and proof, put it together, and they've consolidated it into this rational conclusion. Very difficult to change their mind. What's the only thing that can usually change their mind? New or different data, evidence, and proof. So as an example, if someone were to say, this block is not actually made the way that you think it is, they're like, interesting, let me look at it again. They're like, no, my original conclusion was correct. That's where it stays. So this is, again, a rational thinking preference, a way of coming to conclusions that is entirely based on data, evidence, and proof. Now, this differs from another rational thinking preference, structural thinking. Structural thinking is interesting in that it's very much about sequence and order. So if you take information and you present it to a structural thinker, their brain immediately is like, and they start looking for sequence and order. And they have very interesting, complex ways of finding pattern and sequence. And straight away, a structural thinker would be like, outlier, Gregor, why is this one an odd number? Right? So straight away, and you can see that this is an awkward sequence for a structural thinker. They'll find something more elegant. There are different ways of doing this, and they're looking for this complex sequence and order, and they're doing it over and over again in their brilliant, rational mind. What does sequence and order give to them? It gives them cognitive comfort. With this sequence and order, they are then able to put things into these complex patterns and come to very rational conclusions and ways of seeing information that other people don't always see. When we see a jumble, in their brain, they can immediately put this into place. Now you can imagine I'm doing this fairly slowly because I'm having to move these in a tactile way. Imagine the speed of cognition of a structural thinker, rationally taking complexity and putting it into sequence and order. So what does this mean? It means that if we want to interact with structural thinkers, we don't want to be speaking to them or interacting with them like this. We want to actually be interacting with them in a way that makes sense for their brain. What we're trying to do here is potentially allow people to reach a state of cognitive comfort more quickly. Now, this makes total rational sense, but the next two preferences are not rational. So this is where it gets more complex. Suddenly, we're faced with the idea that there are two preferences, analytical and structural, who are very good at taking complex information and using it in a rational way in order to come to conclusions. But we're now entering the world of intuitive thinking, conceptual, social. Conceptual thinking looks something like this. They will take sequence and purposely break it and add more and more and things that have no apparent relation. They are tangential thinkers. But what's fascinating about this is their brain is constantly seeking something. This is not a jumble for them. For them, this is a cognitive challenge, and they are looking for something. And when they find the one thing, that one point that explains the rest of it, this is what gets their brain excited. They are looking for ideas within the complexity. And once they find the idea, the rest of it is irrelevant. Suddenly the idea itself explains all of the rest. They don't need the details. They don't need all of this information. They simply need the point. And the point is something that they start playing with in their mind. Conceptual thinkers are very good at taking an idea and investigating in ways that other people haven't seen. And then they start to do things that people haven't thought of before. And then they start to look at things and create patterns and sequences, potentially that no one else has noticed. And they start looking at things and building things in their brain, and then taking it apart again and building it up from a single point all over again. The process of conceptual thinking is iterative, but it's also very interesting that the thread of conceptual thinking is very delicate. So when they're having an idea, they're very close to coming up with something that no one else has done before or thought of before, and then someone asks them a question or interrupts them or asks them to pay attention, and the whole thing's gone. And for them, they can't find that initial point anymore. So this is a very delicate form of cognition in that it takes a long time sometimes for them to get to a place where they can explain it. This is an intuitive thinking preference. If you ask someone to explain, and they're a conceptual thinker, and say, why is this so important? How did you understand that this one block holds the key to all of this? They're like, I don't know. I just feel like it does. So conceptual thinking, intuitive, delicate, a tangential way of processing information. And this leads us to the last one, social thinking. Social thinking is a way of processing information in which social thinkers take in information and immediately connect it to other people. So what's interesting is they look at things in an intuitive way, and then they find something that they believe has a potential connection to someone else. And what they will often do is they will take these areas of common ground, cognitive common ground, and they will try and offer it to someone else. And so they'll say, I think this is you. This is me. This looks like you. Is there a common ground here? They're looking for cognitive connection in a very personal way. This feels like me. Are there other people who have this? And if they can find other people who have this within the realm of cognition, they are immediately trying to find connection. And once they establish this connection, they are very, very good at then broadening this into very interesting ways in which they connect it to larger and larger groups of people. And they build bridges that actually end up leading to other cognitive connection. And suddenly what they're able to do is create networks of connection through ideas. So they take this initial idea, they establish common ground, and they're able to connect it to others. What's interesting is social thinking is really the only thinking preference that involves other people. So analytical, structural, conceptual can all be done in isolation. This can actually be done on your own. Social thinking requires connection with others. So they're taking information and trying to find ways to connect it with other people. And if they do, they're able to bring ideas across in ways that actually have a lot of influence. So what we're seeing here is these thinking preferences have inherent complexity. You may have noticed they're contradictory in many places. And there are people who could be both structural and social. You could be structural, social, conceptual. You could be analytical, conceptual, which sounds like it actually has an inherent contradiction. And it does. This is what's fascinating about this, is you could actually have thinking preferences that are constantly contradicting each other, breaking it apart, building it back together, making connections, breaking connections. Now, this realm of contradictory cognition creates some very interesting ideas. It's also fairly cognitively tiring. So some of you may find that your brain actually gets exhausted with itself. It feels overwhelming at times. And this also brings up the idea of neurodiversity and neurodivergency, in which people who are at the extreme ends of these spectrums are often flipping between very high spectrum thinking preferences. And with that inherent gift comes the flip side of it's tiring, and it can often be misunderstood by others. There are ways to explain the way that we think. And I hope that these building blocks, my cognitive building blocks, that were so important to me when I was a child, and now that I watch in wonder as my son Ro plays with them, I hope that they gave you an illustration in a very simple way of how our brains are very different. And recognizing that all of us think very differently. When we run into situations in which we're confused or frustrated with someone else, we should go back to this place of understanding that people think very differently than us. Inside their brain, they have these cognitive building blocks that are often very different than ours. And our role is to be curious about this. This is the idea of cognitive awareness, being aware that people think differently than us. It sounds so simple, especially when you illustrate it like this. We are building things in our brains that are different. We all build things in very different patterns and sequences. Then we get to the place of cognitive tolerance, Cognitive tolerance is the idea that let's be patient with people. Let's understand when someone is struggling to explain something. It is not a personality trait. This is them struggling to explain the complexity within their own brain. It is not easy to do. Finally, we get to the place of cognitive diversity. Cognitive diversity is, can we create environments in which we are able to play, all of us, in an environment that feels safe and comfortable? Can we all sit around this small table and play with cognitive building blocks in a way that's comfortable for us? Can we actually have the fun of encouraging each other, watching and wonder like I do with my child? Can we actually introduce an idea of childlike innocence and curiosity to people's thinking that will allow us, I believe, to overcome some of the judgment that, I don't know about you, but that I felt in my own life when I was young and in professional environments, and even in my personal life. The judgment that has such a detrimental effect on our development, on our own brains, on our ability to reach those really incredible states of cognition. If we can create a state in which people feel safe and playful, I believe that we can start developing very interesting ideas that have the capability to help not only ourselves and the people around us, but potentially even on a larger scale. Thanks.